The night sky over New York was still. But inside the United Nations headquarters, tension hummed like electricity in the air. Delegates from over 100 nations adjusted their seats, whispered behind folders, checked their devices, waiting. Not for another routine speech, but for a reckoning. And then he arrived. Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, stepped into the chamber without a prepared apology, without a diplomatic mask. He came with no intention of kneeling. Just 48 hours earlier, he'd received a 12-page speech, carefully drafted by UN officials and Western diplomats, instructing him to apologize. Apologize for his words on Gaza. Apologize for exposing French and American interference. Apologize for saying out loud what millions had only dared to think. But Traoré didn't come to New York to whisper. He came to roar. Before he ever touched the microphone, the world was already watching. Cameras were rolling, analysts speculating. And in the streets outside, protesters had gathered. Not against him, but for him. One young woman held a cardboard sign high above her head. Africa doesn't apologize. And in that moment, it became clear. This wasn't just about one man. This was about something much bigger. A continent had found its voice. But what happened next inside that chamber stunned even the most seasoned diplomats. Because Traoré didn't just reject the UN's apology script. He tore it apart, line by line, idea by idea, and gave a speech so bold, so direct, it would echo across 3 continents in less than 24 hours. If you believe truth should never be silenced, if you believe Africa deserves to speak without permission, subscribe now, because this is the story they didn't want you to hear. 2 months before Traoré's electrifying appearance at the UN, the world barely noticed the speech that started it all. It was supposed to be routine, a regional summit, a short address. But Traoré didn't do routine. He stood up and said what few leaders dared to say, that Gaza was bleeding, and Africa could no longer remain silent. He compared the cries of Palestinian mothers to the screams heard in the villages of Mali, Niger, and Congo. If we do not speak, he said, we are complicit. That single sentence sent shockwaves. Within days, his government received a formal letter from the UN Secretary-General's office. The language was polite, diplomatic even, but the message was unmistakable. Traoré had crossed a line. He was summoned to New York, not to speak his truth, but to clarify his remarks. Behind the scenes, the pressure campaign intensified. Calls from Washington, Paris, Tel Aviv, offers of incentives, veiled threats, and then the final insult, a 12-page apology speech drafted by anonymous hands. 4 pages asking him to apologize for tone, 3 pages requesting he moderate language, 5 pages demanding he reaffirm shared values. Whose values, he wondered? The ones that kept Africa in debt? The ones that justified silence during genocide? The ones that equated truth with aggression? The document was cold and clinical. No names, no accountability, just polished sentences, engineered to silence. Late one night, his personal phone rang. Not the official line, but the private number only 5 people had access to. A voice introduced himself as Ambassador Richardson from the U.S. State Department. We have a problem, he said. Within the hour, a black SUV with no flags pulled up to the presidential palace. Richardson arrived with 2 unnamed men, uninvited and unannounced. He opened a leather briefcase, laid out satellite images of gold mines, Chinese infrastructure contracts, intelligence on Russian advisors. We know everything, he said. Right now we're calling it economic cooperation. But it doesn't have to stay that way. The implication was clear. Walk back your speech or prepare for consequences. But Traoré was calm. He leaned back and asked one question. When your country invaded Iraq, did you apologize first? Richardson gave a tight smile. That's different. Traoré nodded. Of course it is. When France intervened in Mali, did they seek permission from Africans? Silence. Then let's stop pretending this is about diplomacy. This is about obedience. After they left, Traoré met with his security chief. Leak a story, he said. Make them think I'm reconsidering the speech. The chief blinked. You want them to believe you're backing down? Exactly. Let them relax. By morning, diplomatic circles buzzed. Media outlets reported that Traoré was softening his stance. CNN ran headlines. Burkina Faso's president may seek compromise. BBC quoted unnamed sources hinting at diplomatic resolution. In D.C., analysts toasted what they believed was a strategic victory. But while they celebrated, Traoré stood before 50,000 Burkinabe citizens at Revolution Square. They think we will apologize, he told the roaring crowd. They think we need their permission to speak. But I was not elected to comfort the oppressors. I was chosen to speak for the silenced. In the front row, an old woman clutched her scarf, tears in her eyes. Young men pounded drums, raising fists into the air. Children chanted his name, not because they understood every word, but because they could feel the fire behind them. In that sea of people stood a 12-year-old girl who would later write him a note in pencil, folded 4 times. Please don't let them make you small. We are proud to be African. Traoré read her letter aloud to his cabinet the night before, leaving for New York. It was not just a message, it was a mission. The world expected a politician. What they got was something else entirely, because Traoré had no intention of simply rejecting the apology. He intended to expose why it had been written in the first place. Every sentence in that draft was a leash. Every paragraph a test of loyalty. But Traoré was done playing loyal to those who measured partnerships by submission. He didn't just board a plane to deliver a speech. He boarded that flight to deliver a shockwave, and what he was about to say inside that chamber would not only rewrite Africa's diplomatic script, it would rattle the foundations of the very stage he was invited to bow upon. But what exactly did he say when the cameras turned on? Why did the French delegate walk out in the middle of his address? And what line in his speech made even the note-takers stop writing? You're about to find out. The chamber at the United Nations had seen many speeches, polished statements, carefully measured tones, apologies dressed as diplomacy, but it had never seen what was about to happen. As Traoré stepped up to the microphone, silence fell. Not out of respect, but anticipation. Many expected him to read the prepared apology. Others assumed he would offer some softened clarification. But instead, he adjusted the mic once, looked directly at the assembly, and spoke words that cut like steel. Before you ask me to apologize, let me ask you something. How many of you have apologized for what you've done to Africa? The room froze. Heads tilted. Pens paused. He continued, his voice steady. Did Belgium ever apologize for what it did in the Congo? Did France ever apologize for massacres in Algeria? Did Israel ever apologize for training militias that destabilized our region? Cameras zoomed in. Delegates squirmed in their seats. And then, without warning, Traoré pulled out his phone. The chamber had never seen this before. I want to read something, he said. A message I received this morning from a 12-year-old girl in Ouagadougou. He read aloud, Mr. President, my teacher says you're going to America to speak for us. Please don't let them make you small. We are proud to be African. He looked up. That child has more dignity than this entire room. Gasps echoed softly. Some delegates turned to each other, unsure if this was still a speech or a storm. Then he went further. You accuse me of inciting hatred because I spoke truth. But when bombs fall on Gaza, you call it defense. When thousands of African children starve because of your trade policies, you call it economics. When we rise, you panic. He wasn't shouting. He didn't need to. His words struck with the precision of a surgeon, the force of a hammer. The West speaks of peace while exporting war. The West speaks of democracy while funding coups. The West speaks of aid but delivers debt. At that moment, the French delegate stood abruptly and walked out. Traoré didn't flinch. Let him walk, he said, because this is not just a speech. This is a reckoning. He paused. You could hear the cameras clicking. You could hear breaths being held. Then he dropped what would become the most quoted line of the year. I will not apologize for being African and proud. And if that makes you uncomfortable, then you're finally beginning to understand how we've felt for centuries. Not a single clap, not one. But that wasn't silence, it was shock. Even the translators, caught off guard, slowed their pace. Not because the language was complicated, but because the truth was. The tension was electric. Every line he delivered was a rejection, not of partnership, but of submission. Not of diplomacy, but of domination disguised as diplomacy. When he finished, Traoré didn't wait for approval. He gathered his notes, nodded once, and stepped away from the podium. It wasn't the end of the speech. It was the beginning of something else. Within 3 hours, social media exploded. Clips of the speech raced across platforms. No apology given trended in 6 languages. Journalists struggled to find words. Western media outlets called it fiery, unprecedented, confrontational. But to Africans watching from Johannesburg to Lagos, it was something else. It was honest, raw, necessary. In Nairobi, a professor wrote, "This was not a speech. This was a turning point." In Harlem, a mural went up before the sun rose. Traoré's silhouette, the African continent behind him, painted in red. We don't kneel. And in Jamaica, a radio host played the full speech on air, declaring, "Finally, a president with a spine." Inside the UN, reactions split. Some Western delegates whispered concerns about diplomatic consequences. Others quietly admitted the speech had said what many were afraid to acknowledge. But the most telling reaction came from the African Union. For the first time in years, they called an emergency session. Not about aid, not about conflict, but about unity. A continental response was brewing. Yet, as news spread and headlines circled, one question remained. How would the global powers retaliate? Because speeches like this don't come without consequences. And Traoré knew the storm wasn't over. It had only just begun. But what would that retaliation look like? And how far would the West go to silence a voice it could no longer control? As the echoes of Traoré's speech still lingered in the marble halls of the UN, the real tremors began thousands of miles away. In the streets, markets, classrooms, and town halls across Africa. This was not just a political moment, it was a psychological earthquake. And in Burkina Faso, the ground shifted first. Revolution Square in Ouagadougou, once the site of protests and unrest, became a site of revival. Not just of political ideas, but of action. Within 72 hours of Traoré's return, over 3,000 citizens had signed up to volunteer. No pay, no promises, just purpose. Farmers arrived with hoes and buckets. Teachers brought chalkboards and textbooks. Engineers offered to rebuild irrigation systems using nothing but local tools and indigenous knowledge. A group of teenagers organized a cleanup campaign for abandoned schools, scrubbing walls, repainting rooms, building desks from discarded wood. They weren't waiting for foreign aid. They were building without it. In a televised interview, a grandmother holding her grandchild declared, "I'm not educated, but today I am proud to be Burkinabe." It wasn't just rhetoric. It was a shift in self-perception. Traoré's rejection of the apology had triggered something deeper. A reclamation of ownership over the future. But pride alone wasn't enough. The international response came fast and calculated. The European Union froze 27 million in development assistance. The International Monetary Fund postponed a scheduled debt relief review. French media launched a barrage of smear pieces calling Traoré a military populist, a dictator in civilian clothes, dangerously radical. None of it worked, because while headlines painted him as a pariah, the streets told a different story. In Ghana, university students held forums titled Sovereignty and Self-Reliance. In Nigeria, young activists launched the Not One Apology More campaign. They carried placards showing images of African leaders bowing at international forums. and crossed them out in red. Never again, the posters read. In Senegal, school children were assigned essays on what dignity means in African history. In Tanzania, local radio hosts asked elders to recount the last time they felt represented on the world stage. The calls flooded in. One 83-year-old farmer said, "I never thought I would live to see the day we stopped begging." Across the continent, leaders took notice. Quiet at first, cautious, but moved. Within a week, 43 African ambassadors convened in New York for an emergency African Union session. The agenda was not aid or trade. It was power and how to reclaim it. What emerged was the New York Declaration, a document that would go on to redefine Africa's posture toward the world. Its language was simple but historic. No African nation would apologize for defending its sovereignty, accept aid tied to political conditions, or allow foreign intelligence to dictate domestic policy. 12 African presidents signed it within the first 48 hours. And perhaps more remarkable than the governments was the response from the people. In Lagos, market women refused to sell products from companies tied to foreign interests in Africa's resource extraction. "We're done feeding those who starve us," one woman said. In Nairobi, university professors revised their syllabi to include Traoré's UN speech as required reading. In Cape Town, artists painted a mural stretching half a city block. Mandela passing a torch to Traoré. The words beneath, "From struggle to sovereignty." But while the wave of support was inspiring, it also carried risk. Without IMF disbursements, Burkina Faso faced a short-term budget deficit. Fuel prices rose, import taxes tightened, and yet, approval ratings for Traoré soared to 89%. Because for the first time, people believed they were sacrificing for something real. Not to appease donors, not to meet foreign benchmarks, but to take back ownership of their destiny. That sense of purpose bled into the political fabric. Parliament, once passive and procedural, began debating openly about scrapping outdated colonial-era economic codes. Civil society leaders, often silent for fear of retaliation, now hosted weekly forums on national self-sufficiency. Even opposition figures, though critical of Traoré's methods, admitted the speech had reshaped the country's soul. But outside, the clouds were gathering. The West does not tolerate disruption without retaliation. And in think tanks across Washington and Brussels, the talk had shifted from diplomacy to containment. What if the Traoré effect spreads? What if sovereignty becomes contagious? What if Africa stops asking for permission altogether? And so, as Burkina Faso braced for economic retaliation, a question lingered. Would the people endure the storm that follows standing up? Because history had shown that dignity always came at a cost. But this time, would they be willing to pay it? While Africa stood taller, the West began to shift uncomfortably in its seat. Traoré's speech had not only shattered the diplomatic script, it had pierced the illusion of control. And nowhere was that more evident than in Washington. Inside the State Department, Traoré's name appeared in briefings not as a foreign president, but as a potential threat to global order. Analysts debated whether his defiance was symbolic or contagious. One internal memo warned, if emulated, the Traoré model may accelerate regional instability and reduce U.S. leverage in sub-Saharan Africa by 40% within 5 years. It was no longer about one man. It was about the possibility that others might follow. The IMF responded swiftly. A pending debt relief package for Burkina Faso, valued at $89 million, was quietly suspended. The European Union froze funding for infrastructure projects across the Sahel. The French Foreign Ministry went public, accusing Traoré of destabilizing Franco-African relations. French media outlets, previously disinterested in Burkina Faso, flooded their airwaves with stories painting Traoré as erratic, authoritarian, dangerous. But these moves weren't just punishment, they were warnings, messages wrapped in policy. Speak too boldly and you'll pay a price. Yet despite the pressure, Traoré didn't retreat. He doubled down. In a televised interview with Al Jazeera, he stated calmly, "They speak of preserving partnerships, but what they fear is losing control." Meanwhile, American media struggled to frame the moment. Conservative outlets dismissed the speech as anti-Western propaganda. Liberal publications acknowledged its moral weight but questioned its diplomatic wisdom. But the American people, especially older veterans, civil rights leaders, and diaspora activists, felt something deeper, something uncomfortable, something truthful. For a generation raised during the Cold War, when American influence was seen as a stabilizing force, Traoré's words challenged that legacy. His speech forced a question that many had not heard from a global stage in decades. Has the West confused leadership with dominance? In New York, retired Marine Colonel James Evans wrote a letter to the Washington Post. It read, "I don't agree with everything President Traoré said, but I fought for a country that claimed to believe in freedom, and if that includes Africans choosing their own path, even when it challenges ours, then maybe it's time we listen instead of lead." The letter went viral. Meanwhile, in Europe, the backlash grew louder, but less effective. In Berlin, a think tank panel turned into a shouting match over whether Traoré's speech represented a geopolitical shift. In Paris, students staged a protest outside the National Assembly with signs reading, "Burkina Faso is not your colony." The optics were terrible, and for every dollar withheld, Traoré gained 1,000 new supporters, not just in Africa, but in the Caribbean, in Latin America, in the indigenous communities of Canada and Australia. The West had tried to isolate him, but the more they pressed, the more global his voice became. Yet what worried Washington most was not the applause, it was the competence. Traoré hadn't stumbled into this moment. He had prepared for it. Every sentence in his speech was historically grounded, legally defensible, morally urgent. It was not chaos, it was clarity. For decades, Western intelligence had painted African leadership as unstable, emotional, corruptible. But here was a young man dismantling their narrative with surgical precision. A confidential report from a U.S. policy advisory group leaked weeks later. It described the speech as the most strategically disruptive address delivered at the UN since 1960. It warned that a new class of African leadership, articulate, unyielding, unapologetic, is emerging. If not engaged carefully, it may redefine global diplomacy on Africa's terms. That line, "on Africa's terms," was what truly unsettled them, because it meant the old levers of control were rusting. The tools of influence, aid, trade, debt, diplomacy, were becoming blunt, and the moral authority once claimed by the West was being challenged not by guns, but by language. But perhaps the most powerful shift came not in policy circles, but in living rooms. In Brooklyn, a Haitian grandmother wept watching the speech replayed on a local news channel. "They finally hear us," she whispered. In Accra, a taxi driver kept the radio on repeat, telling every passenger, "This is our turning point." And in Washington, a young black congressional aide printed Traoré's entire speech and pinned it on his office wall. Not out of ideology, but out of pride. Pride that someone somewhere had said the truth without flinching. But what would the world do next? Would they listen or retaliate harder? Would they engage or suppress? The storm was not over. In fact, it was moving westward, and for the first time in decades, the question was not how Africa would respond to the West, but how the West would respond to Africa. The most powerful revolutions are not announced with fireworks. They begin in silence, in soil, in seed. 6 months after Traoré's speech shook the halls of the United Nations, the ground beneath Burkina Faso had changed. Not metaphorically, literally. For the first time in modern history, the country achieved something that Western economists said was impossible without aid: full food security. No foreign NGOs, no imported seed programs, no World Bank frameworks, just Burkinabe farmers, Burkinabe soil, Burkina knowledge. The same traditional farming methods, once dismissed as primitive, turned out to be perfectly suited for the land. Instead of hybrid seeds engineered in European labs, they returned to ancestral techniques: crop rotation, seed conservation, soil water retention. The results shocked even the skeptics. Yields doubled. Dependency vanished. Villages that once waited for rice shipments from overseas were now feeding neighboring towns. This wasn't just agriculture. It was resistance, and it spread. Inspired by the domestic success, Traoré's administration launched a review of every foreign mining contract in the country. Gold, copper, manganese. Burkina Faso is rich beneath its feet. But for decades, over 80% of profits had flowed outward, not inward. Not anymore. Within 4 months, his government renegotiated the top 5 extraction agreements. A new clause was added. 60% of profits must stay in country, invested directly in infrastructure, education, and local enterprise. Foreign companies threatened to pull out. Traoré didn't blink. "If they leave," he said publicly, "we'll dig with our own hands." They didn't leave, because even they understood the ground is rich, but the people are richer. This assertive economic doctrine wasn't just national. It was continental. In the months that followed his speech, 17 African countries restructured their resource contracts. Nigeria passed a law banning the export of unrefined crude. Tanzania declared that all mineral exports must now go through local refineries. Zambia, fed up with decades of copper exploitation, announced that it would only sell to countries recognizing Palestinian sovereignty. These weren't just policies, they were signals. Africa was no longer offering raw value in exchange for finished chains. Sovereignty was being redefined, measured not by flags, but by how much of a nation's wealth remained within its borders. The financial world noticed. The IMF labeled the trend economic nationalism. Western investors called it resource protectionism. African economists had a different term, finally. And as capital began to slow from the usual sources, Africa looked inward. 42 nations signed bilateral trade agreements bypassing Western intermediaries entirely. Kenya and Ghana began exchanging goods through blockchain-based platforms. South Africa launched a Pan-African banking initiative to reduce the reliance on the dollar. For the first time in decades, the idea of intra-African trade wasn't a dream. It was happening. But the most symbolic move came from a nation often overlooked, Namibia. In a quiet announcement, its government revealed it would begin repatriating all foreign-held reserves and reinvesting them into a new sovereign wealth fund modeled after Norway's. The name of the fund? The Dignity Reserve. In Burkina Faso, the momentum continued. Diaspora communities abroad, many inspired by the UN speech, began sending direct remittances not to families, but to community cooperatives. A group of Burkina engineers in France crowdfunded $300,000 to build a solar-powered irrigation system in their home province. In a televised interview, one of them said, "For years, we sent money home to survive. Now we send money home to build." Markets responded, slowly at first, but then decisively. The national currency stabilized despite external shocks. Foreign direct investment from non-Western nations, China, Brazil, Turkey, doubled. And in one historic quarter, Burkina Faso saw its first budget surplus since the early 1980s. But the numbers weren't the story. The story was pride. In the countryside, farmers began branding their produce "No Apology Grown." In the cities, local tech startups emblazoned 100% hours on packaging. Schools replaced imported textbooks with new curricula highlighting African economic systems. And when a Western ambassador privately warned that this path might lead to isolation, Traoré reportedly smiled and replied, "What you call isolation, we call independence." But economic independence brings new enemies. The same intelligence agencies that once tracked warlords began watching spreadsheets. The same news networks that ignored Burkina Faso now dissected every fiscal policy. Because if one of the poorest countries in the world could escape the cycle of dependency, what excuse did the others have? And if they didn't need permission to grow, what else didn't they need permission for? The world was watching, but so was Africa, and in the fields where grain now grows without aid, and in the mines where profits now stay home, one truth became undeniable. When a nation stops apologizing for its potential, it begins to harvest it. 6 months after Traoré walked off the stage at the United Nations, the aftershocks had not stopped. In fact, they had only just begun. What started as a speech had become a shift in global momentum, subtle in places, thunderous in others. But underneath the pride, beneath the headlines, and beyond the murals and movements, a quieter truth lingered. The empire always strikes back. Intelligence briefings circulated across Europe and North America, warning of the psychological contagion of African defiance. Economic institutions quietly debated tightening aid conditionality. Multinational corporations began lobbying for protection measures against African governments reclaiming their resources. Because if this was not contained, it could redefine the balance of global power. Not through war, but through dignity. And dignity is harder to bomb. It can't be sanctioned. It spreads without permission. But while the West recalibrated, Africa braced. The question wasn't if retaliation would come, it was how, and how soon. Would it be trade barriers dressed as environmental regulations? Would it be media narratives labeling new African leadership as radical populism? Or worse, would it be silent sabotage from within? Because the truth is, revolutions are rarely crushed by enemies alone. Sometimes they are smothered by friends who fear the fire will burn too hot. And that is where this story turns to you. Yes, you. Watching from your living room, scrolling on your phone, listening on your morning walk. What does this moment mean to you? Maybe you're a veteran who served believing in liberty. Maybe you're a pastor who taught that dignity is God-given. Maybe you're a grandfather who told your grandchildren to always stand tall, even when it's hard. If so, ask yourself this. What is our responsibility when another people finally rise and say, "No more chains, no more crumbs, no more silence"? What do we owe them? Not in dollars, not in programs, but in principle. Because the truth is, this isn't just a story about Africa. This is a story about all of us who were told to stay quiet. About every nation that was made to feel small. About every voice that was told to soften so that power would not feel uncomfortable. And now they are speaking, not with rage, but with clarity. Not with apology, but with purpose. So what happens next? Will the world listen, or will it punish? Will it embrace a new kind of partnership, or cling to a crumbling hierarchy? Will it finally hear the voice of the continent it once carved into pieces? Or try to drown it out once more? These are not rhetorical questions. They are real, and they are urgent. Because history is not written in speeches. It is written in how the world responds to them. And this speech, this moment, will either be remembered as the beginning of a new chapter or as another chance wasted. But if you feel, even for a second, that this story matters, then don't just watch it. Share it. Speak about it. Stand for it. Because when you amplify dignity, you become part of the revolution. And if this story has touched your heart, if it stirred something deep inside you, maybe a sense of justice, maybe the echo of your own family's past, then do not let it fade. If you believe that Africa has nothing to apologize for, if you believe that partnerships must be rooted in respect, not fear, if you believe that freedom is not a gift, but a choice we must defend every day, then make your voice heard. Share this video. Leave a comment. Subscribe to this channel, not for me, but for the stories they don't want told. And pray with us. Pray not for comfort, but for courage. Not for approval, but for endurance. Because the fight for dignity is long and lonely and worth it. May God bless Africa, land of fire, land of faith, land that will not kneel. And may He bless those who, like Traoré, choose to stand even when the world demands they bow. This is not the end. This is the beginning. And the next chapter is already being written in the hearts of people who refuse to apologize for their existence.